Tillie, the little engine, had been working very hard. Ever since her great rescue of the fairy tale arrow, Miss Ella had been assigning her more out-of-the-yard work, which made her very happy indeed. She loves visiting new places and meeting the other engines who help run the railway. One day, Mrs. Ella had an important job for her. "We've got some spare parts from the works to go to the mainland and some goods bound for Pinewood Island scheduled for the noon Pinewood goods. I need you to take them to Crotoonia Bay so they can be brought to their respective destinations." "Oh, yes, ma'am," said Tillie excitedly. Crotoonia Bay is one of the biggest stations and towns on the Crotoonian mainline, and there were lots of friends she knew there, like Scarloey and Rheneas, the narrow-gauge engines, and Piper, the steam-electric shunter. She collected the spare parts from the goods shed where Farnsworth was getting oiled up from his morning local run. "Well, if it isn't the little switch engine who's off to haul a real engine's train," he said dismissively. "Now, Farnsworth," said Jason, "wasn't it her who took a train you inadvertently caused to derail?" It shut him up instantly. As Tillie backed down on the freight cars, an awkward clanking sound was heard. It was like a pair of exercise weights being bumped together. But outside of the freight cars, nobody else heard it. Tillie soon collected her cars from the goods depot and set off for the junction. But the clanging noise kept ringing out, and the shunters who were fastening cars together in the yard were very worried. As she passed through the cuttings between Colville and Crotoonia Bay, the clanking seemed to get louder and louder. Until... clang! One of Tillie's glides got jammed. Now it would be much harder to push her driving wheels along. But Tillie didn't want to stop to let another engine take over. "I shouldn't give up. What will Mrs. Ella say if I told her I'd broken down with a very important train?" So the little engine decided to press on. She passed through a nearby halt where the Greendale rocket was taking on water. As she passed through, there was a small hissing sound that seemed to follow her. "Tillie," called the rocket, "did you fill up with water before heading out with the train?" But it was no use. She was next to the brake van by the time her message was finished. Soon, Tillie reached the busy town of Crotoonia Bay. Trucks rattled past on the roadways and overpass, construction cranes whizzed about with their work, and there stood the big hill just before the station. "Boop, boop," whistled Henry, who was passing through with an express freight. "Mind the hill today. The sea salt's making it a bit rough." Tillie was ready for hills, so she fired off her sandboxes and charged at the hill. The freight cars tried to slip on their brakes, but Tillie was sure to beat them and press on. As she took on the final slope, James hurried up with a small vegetable train from Fawston. He heard a nasty hissing sound near Tillie when suddenly, pop, a bolt shot out from one of Tillie's pistons. "Rocketing rivets!" shouted James. "What's gotten into you, Tillie? Don't think I can manage this hill, eh, James?" said Tillie excitedly as she made the final incline. "No, I mean there's something wrong inside of your—" Bang! A huge noise rocketed through the station yard. "What was that?" shouted Station Master Scatterbrain, who'd been in the yards checking over a delivery from the main line. "Robbers? Fireworks? A truck backfiring?" "I think you'll find it's a breakdown," said a worried James. Tillie had finally made herself run too much. Her conductor clambered into her cab and examined her controls. "Oh, I knew it," she said. "She's clean out of water. Boiler tube explosion seems to be it. You've worked yourself hard enough to boil water for the whole town." "Jam piston glad too," called a workman. "It's a miracle she made it to the yard safely." Tillie felt horrible. She felt like she had readied herself for the scrap heap. Later that evening, Mrs. Ella visited the Colville works, where workmen were busily freeing Tillie's glide. Tillie's wheels shuddered a little bit. She feared the absolute worst. But instead of a, "Tillie, what did you do?" or a, "Tillie, why wasn't the job finished right?" she heard a very worried, "Tillie, are you all right?" I think so. I'm really sorry about the train this morning. I "Oh, never mind the train," said Mrs. Ella. "What matters right now is how you feel." "Well, I do hurt a little bit, but I thought the train was a big priority, so I pressed on." "I appreciate hard work from my engines," she said. "But I also want to make sure that nobody gets hurt. If you sense that something is wrong, you've got to let someone know. That's just using your stack." "Yes, ma'am. I'll be sure to be more careful next time." "And one more thing," Mrs. Ella said, as she exited the works. "Yes?" asked Tillie. "Get yourself a good night's sleep." And after her little trip up the line, Tillie was sure never to push herself too far again. Really useful engines need their breaks too.
Thomas and Tracy enjoy helping out at the Bluesburg Steelworks. They love visiting their friends Phoebe and Ralph and giving them much-needed help. Ralph is constantly kept busy running the manager about and shifting ladle cars into place, while Phoebe takes on long journeys to Bluesburg West Junction and beyond. But the yard had many orders to fill for the next few weeks, and even the extra 2 engines weren't enough to keep things running. That was when Diesel, Audrey, and Bert came in. Diesel was in charge of the docks at Crotoonia Bay, while Audrey and Bert had been brought in from the Sodor Ironworks for a period. Together, the engines had a known reputation for pranks and mischief-making around other engines. They arrived one busy morning. Thomas and Tracy were arranging a freight train for Big Tim to bring out when they oiled into the main yard. "Hello, Puffball," said Audrey. "So the big old steelworks can handle with a teapot on rails? Figured they'd send for some modern diesels to help with the extra workload." "You'd be modern 70 years ago," quipped Ralph. "Now, as manager's diesel of the Bluesburg Steelworks, we're gonna need you to—" "On a rusty matchbox on wheels for a boss. Boy, you really need proper diesels around here," Bert greasily chirped. "Why, you?" "All right," said Phoebe coolly. "Now that we've gotten to know each other, let's get to work. Diesel, dockyard deliveries. Audrey and Bert, you're working the pier." And she confidently went back to the steelwork shed to work. The Diesels did prove to help out a little bit, but many problems soon arose with their presence. They shoved trains into the wrong sidings, took any chance they got to make fun of or play tricks on Ralph and Tracy, and Diesel would bump Thomas or take the right away from him. Altogether, the 3 engines were gradually getting fed up with the Diesel's trickery. Phoebe, on the other hand, wasn't particularly bothered. No matter what prank she got, she took it all in stride. "Thank you for arranging my freight cars, Audrey," she said to him after getting bumped with freight cars. "I really needed the washdown, Bert," she said when shunted while taking on water. "Your brakes need checking," she said when bumped by Diesel. All in all, the freight engine was proving to be very tough to break. And Diesel and his cronies were more determined than ever to push her to the edge. Next morning, Thomas and Phoebe were sent to Selgreb City with a heavy freight train. They were to be transferred to another train heading out for Pennsylvania in the afternoon. "Make sure to mind yourselves while we're gone," puffed Phoebe. "And mind yourselves if you have to go through Bluesburg West." "Huh," said Diesel. "We can handle that yard easily." And determined to prove they were capable, he requested that he, Audrey, and Bert be coupled to the next train heading out through there. "There's a 12 o'clock express to go to Folston, but you'd better watch out there. It'll be rush hour." But the Diesels weren't thinking or listening. They were too busy thinking how clever they were to realize what they were getting themselves into. nor had they been paying attention to the freight cars in the yard.
Who are they to boss us around, punting us like footballs around the yards? This is Phoebe's yard, and Ralph's too. Let's teach him a lesson, boys.
The Diesels were soon on their way with their heavy freight train. Although advised by the conductor to take at the very least a transfer caboose, they chose to take it as a triple header.
The Diesels on the other railways have no trouble hauling it all at the front with no van, so why should we worry?
But they had forgotten that Diesels on the other railway have special devices to minimize the usage of brake vans and cabooses. Bluesburg West is a very dangerous yard for a careless engine. There's few signals located throughout it, and engines must take care and pay close attention when entering or exiting the yards. Engines must always be prepared to give off 4 short whistles to alert the signalman in the control tower that they are there. But Diesel and the twins hadn't bothered to remember. They just hurried through the tunnel to the junction. The car's chance had come.
On! On! On!
They yelled, and with a mighty shove, the cars took the Diesels by surprise and surged the speeding engines into the junction. The signalmen were shocked and put in a full-on panic, frantically trying to avoid a collision. 2 mainland Diesels nearly hit them at the entrance, they almost hit Callie at an intersection, and Douglas nearly lost his tender.
Phew, said Diesel. We're home free now.
But they weren't. They hadn't accounted for Alea, a little shunting engine who was pushing a line of freight cars to go to Groffman Harbor. She was entering the main line.
Oh no!
Screamed Diesel as he shut his brakes hard on. Then, disaster struck. Diesel was on his side next to the crash, dazed, confused, and bruised. Some of Alea's cars had been thrown right off the track, and with Ari and Bert derailed on the switch, no one from the main line could get into the junction. "Hang on!" shouted Alea. "I'll fetch a crane and send for a few others!" By the time the mess was cleared, Phoebe and Thomas were returning from their big run. Phoebe was a little bit entertained from the debacle. "Well, well, well, 3 Diesels too big for their buffers couldn't manage steel cars, eh?" Diesel was fuming. "Well, if you treat wagons and engines like that, then it's gonna bite you in the tail lamp," she said firmly. "Right, shall we try and haul these cars to the yards?" "If it helps a bit," said a tired but still willing Thomas. It took some time to tidy up the mess, but soon everything was put right again, and Thomas and Phoebe hauled away the wagons to Foston. What about Diesel, Larry, and Bert? Well, it wasn't long before the Culver Works set them back up and running again. But they don't mess with steel cars anymore, because they know they'll try to fight back.
Mike was cross. The thin controller had assigned him to ballast duties for being naughty, and Mike hated being stuck at the mines all day. He found it rather boring. One morning, Mike arrived at Chipperton Wharf with a loaded train of ballast. He saw Duncan, who was getting his train loaded. "Morning, Mike. What's up?" "I feel overworked. That's what's up," huffed Mike. "I've been going up and down the line all day, stuck with the ballast trains, and all because I burst a safety valve and started an elderly woman." Duncan pondered for a moment. You know, if I was on your wheels, I would have probably taken a break up on the coast at Birmingham. You know, have the ocean breeze in your face. Your line does run up there after all. And with that, Duncan set off for the quarry. This gave Mike an idea. All that week, Mike tried everything to sneak off to Birmingham. He tried to sneak ballast cars and lumber cars out as a construction delivery. He tried to run off light engine on his own and even begged the yard manager to let him go there. At last, he finally got a job on the resort end of the line, but not the one he had hoped for.
An express train needs to be arranged at the Swahili Water Park Resort for a group of tourists. I need you to bring them some coaches so they have enough for the train to carry them.
Yes, sir, said Mike, but he had a plan. Mike knew of one carriage that had a faulty coupler pin on it, so he coupled that to the front of his train. As he trundled out with 5 heavy covered carriages, he felt the pin push against him as he went downhill. Not yet, he said. We've got to wait until we reach the resort. As he approached the resort station, Scott, the express tank engine, was waiting for Mike's extra coaches. As he pulled into the platform, he put his plan into motion. With the pin loosened enough, left on the platform were the carriages for the train, and off went Mike. What the? Said Scott.
Slow down, Mike,
said his driver.
We just passed by the station.
But Mike wasn't listening. He was bolting it to the Birmingham coast. Stations and shunting yards flashed by as his driver fought for control of the regulator. At the big station in Birmingham, there were a pair of buffers on the other side of the turntable, just at the tail end of the shunting yards. Mike was still not paying any attention until he saw the buffers. Then everything happened at once. Mike found himself standing on the sand instead of the rails with the remains of the buffers behind him.
Don't worry, Mike,
called out his driver.
I'll go phone for help.
Mike sighed. There had been a break, but not the one he had hoped for. Back at the Swahili Water Park Resort, Scott was still confused about what had happened as he backed down onto his coaches. Suddenly, he heard a blast of whistles and the clattering of equipment as Rashira and Grace the crane roared past. "Clear the tracks!" shouted Rashira. "Derailed engine at Birmingham Beach!" "Oh, mind your speed!" called Grace. "My gears are rattling!" As Mike was lifted back onto the rails by Rashira and Grace, he saw that Rex and Bert were also there. They'd come to help repair the tracks and buffers beyond the turntable.
Well, Mike, you said you wanted a break from all the work you've been getting, but we never thought you would have it this way,
finished Bert. "Well, if I must admit, it was all right," said Mike. "But I didn't think the only break that happened would be to a pair of buffers." The 3 engines laughed in agreement.
Easy peasy, lemon squeezy.
Livi is a sturdy tank engine in charge of McCrackenton Freight Depot. It's near a small town just near the hills beyond Calville and Foston, and often gets deliveries from all over the railway. But the depot is not as big as others on the railway, which makes her feel very uptight about it. If it's not Livi's way, then it's the highway. One night, Livi was cooling her firebox for the night when Jebediah, the engine who pulled the Calville milk train, eased into the sheds. He was a very kindly engine, but he was rather worn out compared to the other engines. Ugh! Keep your soot off my tanks, old-timer, snapped Livi. I've got an image to keep up with my yard. I'm sorry, Livi, puffed Jebediah, but my chug isn't what it used to be. My rods have been jamming up for the last little bit, so I've had to burn more to puff more. But why are you here now? I'm glad you asked, said Mrs. T-Mark, who ran the depot and was preparing to head home for the night. We've just gotten a contract to store and deliver dairy products from all over the railway beginning tomorrow. Livi was shocked. Her yard a dairy yard? But why? Can't that Cormac keep track of cheese with his silly prawns? I'm sorry, Livi, but we finalized the agreement. But it will keep our yard busy, and it'll open up a lot of opportunities if we do it well. But Livi didn't think so. Her yard had to be the way she wanted it. Next morning, the first load started to crawl in with Jebediah's first train. He brought churns of milk from the Gradinia Bay and Calville dairies. Then Tootle delivered cream from Inkblada Towers Creamery. Then Emily delivered butter and eggs from Cliffstone Farms. And Olwen delivered the biggest load of all, cheeses from the Selgrub Bay Cheese Company. Every cheese you could imagine was packed into vans. Cheddar, mozzarella, feta, Swiss, string, Stilton, and even Wensleydale. The vans and refrigerated cars all packed the yards. Siding after siding seemed to be moving vans out and then vans in. Livi couldn't stand it. My yard should be an industrial space with construction materials, containers, and important things. Not a storage yard for a cheese festival. Did someone say cheese? And the more and more freight came in, the more and more she got tired of it. And she didn't treat poor Jebediah any nicer, especially when his rods finally gave out when parking home at the sheds one night.
Oh, gosh darn it.
Oh, fantastic, she cracked. Now what are we going to do about the Calville train?
Don't fret about it, said Mrs. T-Mark. I'm sure Mrs. Ella will find another engine for the job. Now you'd better find a flat car and get poor Jebediah over to the works.
And so she did. But her words flew around in her boiler. Find another engine to do the job. Find another engine to do the job. And that's when Livi made a plan. A firelighter comes every morning to ready the engines for the day. After the firelighter left this morning, Livi put her plan into motion. She rounded up every dairy car in the yard and coupled them all together. Then, with a bit of strain, she began to haul the cars off down the line to Bluesburg West Yard. They've got so many sidings there that little blue pressure cooker won't mind having some extra work to do. But she'd forgotten about Foston. Foston has two main line connections, a passenger line that leads up to the big station and the small commuter station, and a freight line that goes through the goods yard. Livi was hoping she'd be taken onto the passenger line where she usually went with her traffic. But the signalman hadn't known about Livi, and she was kept on the goods line, following a slow freight before her. Oh, bother, she said. Miss T-Mark will be finishing her breakfast and driving to the yards by now. But that was about to be the least of her worries, for there came a sound that rattled through her vents. Oh no! She cried. It's the Sunrise Skyrocket! She tried to go faster, but there were too many cars behind her. She thought she would be okay, but just as the train was halfway across the points, two cars were in pieces. No one had been hurt, and soon Tracy arrived with workmen to help clean up the mess. Miss T-Mark also arrived onto the scene of chaos. Cheese and butter lay all over the track. But worst of all was Livi. She was splattered with cheese all across her side tanks. And as if she didn't make herself look silly enough, 2 wheels of Stilton were stuck and melting on her 2 whistles. You're very lucky that only a small part of the deliveries are being delayed thanks to you. But I hope you understand now that there are times when you should talk to us about concerns. But thinking cheese and milk cars make your yard look silly is not one of them. Yes, ma'am. Sorry, ma'am. Once you've been cleaned up and mended, you can take care of Jebediah's milk train until he's repaired. And you learn to think of more than what you'd like the yard to be run like. Yes, ma'am.
Early one morning, Harry was struggling to get some freight cars moved from a siding. They were needed for a mixed traffic train that Donald and Douglas were to take to Nantasket Junction.
Come on! Come on! I'm gonna be late for my next job!
He groaned. His wheels spun and spun. The reason why the cars weren't moving at all was because their brakes were set. But he didn't realize this and just kept on pulling and pulling.
Come on! He groaned. I wish I was moving instead of standing still!
Suddenly, the coupling between him and the first freight car broke, and Harry ran right into a siding, smashed through some buffers, and stopped halfway across an old tramp steamer. Luckily, no one was hurt, but Harry's front was badly bent. Skipper Stu and the harbor master came over to see if Harry was all right.
Well, the only major damage is bent buffers,
said the harbor master.
Oh, botheration,
said Skipper Stu.
Harry and Hamish were to collect the coastline flyer in an hour. Who can we get to take the train on such short notice?
Luckily, Russ was close by and heard everything.
I can take it,
he called out.
Are you sure, Russ?
The harbor master called back.
It's a tough train to pull.
Of course! We've got to keep the trains to time, you know.
Well, all right. But we've got to send Hamish to help out with the backlog while Harry's being mended. So you'll need to find another engine who can help you take the coastline flyer.
Yes, ma'am, Russ tooted confidently. I can manage that. But as Russ got closer to Selgreb Bay Harbor, he remembered something he should have kept in mind before. The Coastline Flyer was an express goods train usually hauled by Harry and Hamish that stops at every harbor along the Seaside Railway. Starting from Selgreb Bay, it goes on to Grothlin and then goes all the way down to Gardinia Bay at the end of the line. Russ was worried, but was sure that he could find someone at Selgreb Bay who'd be happy to lend a wheel, just in case the train was too heavy for him to pull alone. Well, looks like I'll just have to ask the first engine I meet if they'll be able to help me, he decided as he pulled into the bustling dockyard. As he sorted out the containers for his train, he saw a little tank engine sitting on a siding, waiting for help.
Hello there,
he said.
You've got an interesting crane arm. Where's your hook? I'm a reach stacker. I have clamps instead of hooks. That's intriguing. I've never met a reach stacker engine before. Oh,
Beg pardon for not introducing myself. I'm Stepney.
And my name's Russ. I've got a big freight train to take to Crotoonia Bay, but I'm not sure if I can do it on my own.
I'd be more than willing to lend a buffer,
said Stepney cheerfully.
I'm catching a ferry there anyway.
Great, honked Russ. We'd better hurry if we're to get the goods delivered on time. As the two shunted together the loads to hook up, Russ told him about his work in Groflin and the many different engines he worked with, while Stepney told him about his time in Crotoonia, in which he'd been visiting to be part of a great locomotive show at Selgreb City Sheds, and now had to return to his home in England, the Bluebell Railway. Russ and Stepney decided to take the train in two halves. Russ would haul the containers, and Stepney would haul the other loads, tankers, fish, stone, produce, and products from the factories around the city. When all was shunted and ready, the two set off down the seaside railway with their important train. Unfortunately, they didn't get very far, as the first stretch to get out of the harbor was uphill. They tugged and pulled, but no matter what, the engines couldn't get their trains up the slope.
I'm sorry, Russ. This train seems to be a bit tougher to haul up than I thought.
You're right, sighed Russ. The coastline flyer is too heavy for both of us to pull separately, and if we leave later, we won't have time to uncouple each of the cars for the docks. Then, as if by magic, both engines came up with the same idea. They decided to arrange each of their trains into two new halves. Cars for Groflin were coupled to Stepney, and cars for Crotoonia Bay were coupled to Russ. Both brake vans were coupled together, then Stepney with his train, and then Russ and his train. With an engine hauling at the front and an engine to haul from the middle, the two could get up the hill and on their way down the line. The rearranged train also made it easier to drop off and pick up cargo at the two stops. Stepney's cars were uncoupled, and new cars of steel, fish, and lumber were coupled on. They made it to the docks just in time. Well, it was a pleasure to work with you today, Stepney. It's a pity you have to go home now. Likewise, Russ. But I'm glad your crew have such a good friend. Keep everything in order back home, and who knows, maybe I'll visit here again. Goodbye, Russ, and Godspeed. Russ then rolled home, confident, ready for bed, and glad he had found himself a new friend.
Stew is a very efficient engine. Being the dockmaster's diesel of Groflin Harbour, he always works to make sure the docks are tick-tock and on the clock. Unfortunately, this attitude does have a tendency to cause some, problems. One night, as the seaside locomotives were cooling their fireboxes and engines, Skipper Stew was rolling into the roundhouse. The engines were surprised. "What are you doing here tonight, Skip?" asked Oliver. "Passenger detail. The Seaside Rail Co. scheduled a test run for our new express passenger service for tomorrow, but the new engine she bought hasn't arrived yet, so I, of all engines, am to take the train tomorrow." "That That sounds lovely, said Emma. Not when you're the dockmasters, Diesel. I feel like I should stay here and keep things running. But we all help to do that, said Jones the Steam, even whilst we have engines out of action. Like how I'm taking care of the containers while Russ is on holiday, said Gripper the Crane. Suppose you've got a point, said Skipper Stu. In that case, I'll keep this passenger run on the clock. And with that, he went straight to sleep. Next morning, however, showed that not everything would be on the clock. Skipper Stu, keeping in proper Navy fashion, woke himself up well before dawn. Unfortunately, the ship was still far out at sea by the time he got there. Trains came in and out of the terminal, and buses put-putted in and out for a good hour while he was waiting. At last, the big cruise ship carrying his passengers finally arrived and quickly boarded his coaches. Stu's train would only stop at the harbour stations, so the coaches were special for the long trip. There was a break coach, a luggage van, a sleeper, a diner, and a lounge, all coupled together for the long journey. At last, everyone was on board, and Skipper Stu was ready to go. Tick-tock, we're on the clock, off we go, lads, he called out, but the coaches weren't ready. The conductor's not ready! The conductor's not ready! They called out, but it was no use. Skipper Stu was moving. Had he not been flagged down, he would have left the luggage van and the brake coach behind. Skipper Stu felt very embarrassed. All the way to their first stop in Groflin, it seemed like nothing went right. Because they were late, they were switched off on a loop siding to let Yamon hurry past with some freight cars. Then, he ran into trouble with Donald at the salt mines. And to make things worse, the inclines proved very troublesome for Skipper Stu, causing the coaches to rock about and give the passengers an unpleasant experience. Passengers trying to sleep were given an unwanted massage. Hotcakes and bagels flew across the diner, and passengers trying to take pictures were given blurry results. At last, they made it to their first stop. The grumbling passengers boarding the mainline connections and ferry boats at the dock got off, and some new passengers got in. Harry and Hamish, the express freight diesels, were surprised to see their boss worn out and stressed. Oh, how do engines manage this? I've run this train to time, and I've run into nothing but trouble. Well, we're not experts on the matter, said Harry, but passenger trains aren't like freight, said Hamish. They're right, you know, said a voice. It was Olwen, who'd been hauling Isabel and Dulcie while Oliver was working at the salt mines. Passengers are not meant to be treated like soldiers, and coaches aren't meant to be treated like cars. You need to be gentle, smooth, and above all, relaxed. So, don't order them on board? Correct. And don't rock them about? Correct. Just be relaxed and keep steady. Just then, the conductor blew his whistle. All aboard! He called out as Skipper Stu tooted to say, all clear. And now, knowing that the passengers and luggage were safely aboard, he started off. The ride up to Crotoonia Bay was much smoother. Skipper Stu didn't run into any loop sidings or jerk about on inclines. He just hauled his way up quickly but steadily. The passengers could sleep comfortably in the sleeper. The diners could enjoy their lunches of hot hamburgers, sandwiches, wraps, and soft drinks. And sightseers could take in the beauty of the Crotoonian coast. And when they arrived at the harbour, Skipper Stu waited patiently for the passengers to reboard his coaches. Then, they all travelled down the same route home, stopping at each stop without fail. Finally, he made his last stop late into the night. His passengers boarded the final cruise ship bound for the mainland, and the express coaches were shunted away to the yards. Well done, said Dockmaster Eric. I heard you improved a great deal after what happened this morning, and the express has been a great success. Therefore, I am proud to say, thank you, good Eric, interrupted Stu. But I do have my dockmaster's duties to fill. Oh, I wasn't going to have you take over. Then, What were you going to say? But I must stop here, I'm afraid, or I'm going to spoil the next story.
One morning, Sasha the little local puller engine was at the seaside roundhouse. She noticed Emma turning around to go to Selgra Bay instead of Gradinia Bay. Where are you going? Don't you have something to do? Not yet. Dockmaster Noisy wants me to welcome the newcomer. There is a newcomer? There was. A new engine had arrived to Crotoonia. Her name was Audrey, and she was quite a different engine compared to many of the other Crotoonians. She had a big, bulky buffer beam, smart dark blue paintwork, and a big, sturdy tender. She was about to go on her maiden voyage, and a large group of engines were there to welcome the new engine to the crew, with the newly christened Seaside Soarer. Hello, welcome to our railway. Let me know if you need anything shunted. How much coal can your tender carry? But Audrey was very quiet. She didn't seem to care much about the questions and comments. As Sasha arrived backwards, Audrey's first train set off for Rollin Harbor. Sasha saw the powerful engine roar out of the docks. She was impressed by how strong she was and how long and fancy her new carriages were. But then she remembered. She was a very small train, with very small carriages that had to load outside the platform. It made Sasha feel very lowly indeed. Sasha's job was to pull the local, a small passenger train that stopped at every station to drop off all kinds of passengers and workers. Captains to Selgra Bay docks, miners and crane operators to Bartlett Bay, tourists to Rollin Harbor, beachgoers to Coast View Junction, and workers to Gradinia Bay Junction. The days were long and busy for the little engine, but she loved looking at all the different things on her route. Cliffs covered in moss, waves rippling along the coastline, trees standing proud and strong on their perches, and small seaside towns busily going about their days. But whenever Audrey passed by, roaring with her carriages and important passengers in tow, it always made her feel silly. I look at the scenery, making my passengers late, while Audrey is fast and on time. Later that day, as she was on her way back, she ran down the little line on the cliffs of the salt mines, where she found a very shocking sight. There, blowing steam from what looked like every cylinder of her boiler, was Audrey. Are you alright, Audrey? Asked Sasha. Well, started Audrey in a very flat voice. Pistons are pumping, water pressure's good. Steam pressure, not so much. I do need to get these passengers moving again, though. They're catching a ship to Britain at Rollin Harbor. Then Sasha got an idea. I can take your passengers to the docks. That's my next stop with my train. Oh, but my carriages aren't fancy and glamorous. They don't have dining bars or sleeper beds. Just plain old seats and luggage racks. Well, do you get your passengers to their places on time? Well, not all the time. Sometimes the scenery takes away my focus and... I don't blame you, said Audrey, to the shock of Sasha. This railway's got some pretty looking scenery. But the point is, if you're steaming and you got coaches, you're good. You got this, little bud. With that, Sasha had found confidence she'd never had before. Whistling,
"Peep, peep! Get in quickly, please!"
Audrey's passengers for Groflin climbed into her carriages, and the little engine set off for the docks. Sasha's carriages were heavier than usual, but she was determined to make it to the docks on time before the ship left for Britain. Her funnel was firing smoke and steam like never before. Her pistons rattled as she built up steam, and she was moving so much past her usual top speed that a local fisherman lost his hat to the sea, where a whale found it a fine new addition to its Sunday best. Finally, the little engine reached the docks, just in time for the ship to collect its last load of passengers. Then, Sasha hurried over to Skipper Stu.
"We've got an emergency! Audrey's broken down near the salt mines. We need the breakdown gang and dock as soon as possible."
"Leave it to me," said Skipper Stu. Doc and the workmen carefully examined Audrey, whose steam had dampened down quite a bit from earlier. Duck had already taken her carriages away, and Sasha had let Oliver take the last of her passengers home to bring over tools to mend her.
"Well, you're very lucky, Audrey," said Doc. "You just had a tad too much pressure built up in your pistons. Common issue with a new build."
"Thanks, Doc. But you know, I'd have been a bigger goner without Sasha. She was the real hero of this situation. If she hadn't run so gallantly, a lot of people would have missed their boat. Wish I had the same control you seem to with all of those hills, I tell you." Sasha couldn't help but blush a little. It made her feel bigger and stronger than she thought she was. Audrey and Sasha are now firm friends. Audrey sometimes asks Sasha for help, but sometimes has to remind Sasha not to keep comparing herself to her. She's an amazing engine, just the way she is.
Love working on the Crotoonian coast. They work hard bringing ships into port, moving barges, or generally helping out along the docks. One morning, Ariel was at the pier assigning each of the tugs their work for the day. Everyone else had been sent by Eric to help out at the other harbors, so the rest of the tugs had been kept busy. Sunshine, we need you on the oil tanker contract. Warrior, you and Top Hat have garbage to collect. And Theodore and 10 cents? You're with me on the Beamer Island construction site this morning. I'll see if we're clear to get Bonavista and Barrington. All the tugs were ready to go to work, but Top Hat was cross about having to have garbage before taking an important ship out to sea, and George taking his place at the car ferry dock in Gradinia Bay. So he took it out on 10 cents. Of course Ariel's got you on a construction contract. That's all you little switches are good for. But Sunshine's got a tanker to take out to sea later, so we're good at doing big buck too. Oh, please. If Ariel really needed you for the big job, she would have given it to you then, And the uppity railway tugs fumed away. Take no notice of him, puffed Warrior as he left the pier. He's just a little grumpy, that's all. Aye, said Sunshine. Ariel and Eric know you're a tough tug. As he and Theodore left with Bonavista and Barrington for Beamer Isle, he was still venting. Count on Top Hat to say our switches are too small for real work. Wind Sunshine carried out this big ship from Europe the other way, and we had no problems there. But Theodore wanted the best for all his friends and tried to ease him down. I'm sure Top Hat didn't mean all of it. You've helped him the other big tugs out of problems before, like when Sunshine was friend when he first came to your harbor. This made 10 Cents feel a lot better, and the two tugboats soon started swapping stories all the way to the building site. Ariel's job for the tugs at Beamer Isle was to help build a new wooden dock for tourist boats to visit the island and explore. The lighthouse that gave the island its name was also going through repairs, so Griff and Tiff, the crane tugs, were busy near the little island too, with Bonavista lifting pieces from Barrington into place and garbage barges of junk and scrap to haul off. It was tiring work for everyone involved, especially when Griff and Tiff showed off. Look at this old tire rack bound, bragged Griff. Can it beat this old traction wheel from the old power station? Replied Tiff. But no matter how hard the work got, or how showboaty the crane tugs got, 10 Cents and Theodore were still working hard. Later, as 10 Cents was off to the garbage docks with another load of rusty tin cans and junk from the bottom of the island, he was rounding a buoy to mark where the bay began, when all of a sudden... Whoa! Screamed 10 Cents. Look out! Screamed the ship as it swerved violently out of the way to avoid hitting 10 Cents. She turned so suddenly that some of her cargo swerved off its base. Some stayed on deck, but one container wasn't so lucky. Oh no! I'm so sorry for spilling your cargo. Don't panic, man, said the still breathless ship. I'm lucky that was an empty. Sorry, I wasn't looking where I was going. You're... Let me guess, said 10 Cents. Really small? No, said the ship. You're pretty easy to spot. Just hard to see when you've got a full load. Could you get that container back, though? Said the ship. I need it for some cargo I'm picking up from Panama. 10 Cents said it would be no problem, and he hurried off to find Bonavista and Ariel for help. Sometime later, Ariel and Bonavista had gotten a ship whose name was Shirley to guide her hook down into the bay. A group of other boats had gathered around the spot where the salvage was being done, and Griff and Tiff were teasing 10 Cents about the ordeal. Always making a mess. That's what a switcher's good for, snapped Griff. Betting a tiny tug could lose a big container, whispered Tiff. Okay, 10 Cents, called Ariel. Bring Bonavista near me. Everyone was surprised. The job was done. We've got work to do, complained Griff and Tiff. Is it a monster? Trembled Scuffy, the tiniest tug on the harbor. Just bring it down. You're not gonna believe what we found. And so, Bonavista was moved, and her hook lowered, and lowered, and lowered, until... I've hit something, called Bonavista. Probably an old junk barge, said Tiff. That's what my fishing's always found. But when Bonavista raised her hook, it wasn't junk at all. It was a chest. A big old wooden chest. No, it can't be, said Griff in shock. Is it? Silvering sticks. It's treasure, called Warrior. Ariel and Bonavista had reeled up a treasure chest. It was filled like a jelly donut with rubies from long ago. It must have been swept over from the great wreck of Old 45, said old Olson, the Navy tug. Good find, Ariel. Well, I wouldn't have found it without 10 Cents. All the tugs gave a huge chorus of toots. Hooray for 10 Cents' mistake! Just then, Top Hat came around with a barge of scrap. I say, what's going on here? I've been getting out the rubbish in twice the time Warrior can, so what's so special that's left me in a bayside blockade? Everyone couldn't help but laugh.